Well, good morning. Happy Wednesday. It's time for our midweek check-in. We call it Coffee with PC, and I have my coffee here, a little different than the normal hot cup of coffee. I like these from time to time, a little cold double shot espresso with cream. Buy these from time to time. I will actually not be enjoying this with you this morning, or part of my morning. Literally, as soon as I popped the tab to open it, a bug flew right in, and so much for this coffee. I will just put that over there and pour it out a little bit later. I hope your coffee this morning is, well, a little less eventful than mine and doesn't have any uninvited guests doing the backstroke along the top. But I always appreciate you tuning in for a few minutes today to talk about some things. I'm going to be reading from the book of Philippians. I'm kind of in that part of the New Testament with my reading through the Bible and the letters of Paul, getting just a few weeks till I've done the whole Bible in this last year, which is kind of neat to do. But was in chapter 4 today, and these words, they always hit me, but I don't know why, maybe particularly today jumped out. Chapter 4, verse 4, Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, Paul says, rejoice. Interesting words. Interesting particularly that he actually repeats it. It's just a point of emphasis. Rejoice in the Lord always. Let me say it again, rejoice, as if he really wants us to understand how important it is. And it is important. And that word always is a really tough word for me, because it really depends. On the one hand, it's a word that's hopeful, that Paul would say rejoice in the Lord always, telling me it's possible to have joy in my relationship with God always. But at the same time, it can be a little convicting, because there are times in my life where maybe I don't feel that joy. But the beauty of this passage, it has several verses that I bet you are familiar with. Chapter 4 of the book of Philippians, just kind of one after the other, some verses that maybe you like me are familiar with, have memorized over time, and that's no different here, because after this exhortation, this command, rejoice in the Lord, I'll say it again, rejoice, he says, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. You know, when I think about joy in my life, maybe you're the same way, I always think of it as, we might even think of it as optional. Like there are these fleeting moments, these feelings that come and go as life allows, the ups, as it were, in life when things are going well, and we sense that, and we get that sense of joy. But on the other hand, that reminds us that too often our joy is rooted in our feelings of security, in our feelings of comfort, in our feelings of success, that our joy can be directly tied to how we sense life is going. But what does Paul say? Rejoice in the Lord always. Not just when you feel like it, but rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. It's this incredible thing. Now, we need to remember, you probably realize this, some of you have been around church a while, that Paul was writing this letter, the letter of Philippians, in prison. So if there's anybody who had reason to not look at their circumstances and think, hey, this is great cause for joy, it'd be Paul. But we also see, even in the book of Acts, there are times when in prison, Paul demonstrated joy. He and Silas in jail at midnight, singing praises and hymns to God. That was something that was not just that he said to us in this passage, but that he understood through his own experience, which is why in verse 6 he would say, listen, if you want to have this joy always, understand that there's going to be something that's going to come along and try to rob you of your joy. He says particularly, don't be anxious about anything. Life has things that happen to us that make us anxious. And when we become anxious, that sort of undermines, we might say, our joy. But notice he says, don't be anxious. Instead, in every situation, rejoice always. In every situation, a few verses later, he says, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And what happens then? Then the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, guards your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. If we're going to rejoice always, you know what it's going to take? A guarded heart and a guarded mind. Because when we look at our world, and particularly right now, given the realities of our world, we might catch our heart kind of wandering off and beginning to desire things like, oh, I wish that this was what was happening, or right now I really wish we could do these sorts of things, and we can't. I hear that about with realities in regard to lots of places in our society. I'm a big fan of sports, and they're going to be college football starting up, and instead of stadiums packed with people, there'll be little pockets here and there, and a lot of people say, boy, I wish I could go to the stadium and hear the roar of the crowd of my favorite college. Down here we have Miami. Maybe if you're a Gator, we have some Seminoles in here. Those teams are gearing up as well, and you say, oh, I really want that, but so that's your heart kind of pulling you in some way. And if you let your heart pull you that way, what begins to happen? Well, you begin to lose your joy, because you say, my heart wants this, but right now I can't have that, so I don't feel so good. And Paul says, through the inspiration of the Lord in this passage, we need somebody to guard our heart in that way from being pulled away. And it also needs to guard our minds. When our heart begins to pull us that way, our mind begins to think. We begin to imagine things and think things and remember things that can also pull us away from joy. And instead of breeding contentment and joy, it breeds a little discontentment. And what does Paul remind us? He kind of links these three things. Rejoice always. And one of the ways you can make sure you have an attitude of joy is to be someone who prays in every circumstance with thanksgiving. Joy, prayer, thanksgiving. These things seem in this passage to be combined. And by the way, in the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, Paul gives us those same three things in rapid fire fashion. He says, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. There's something about keeping those three things together that help us find and experience joy. And I think between that command in verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always, I'll say it again, rejoice, and the encouragement in verses 6 and 7 to pray in every situation, to not be anxious, but to pray with thanksgiving is the key. In verse 5, he reminds us, the Lord is near, or the Lord is at hand. Between the encouragement, the command, and the encouragement to pray is that reality. And when we think about that, how important, how vital to our joy is remembering that God is near. Remembering that we have the privilege as people who have placed our faith in his Son Jesus, that we can approach the very throne of grace, the very throne of heaven and earth, with confidence, with boldness, and there receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. We have this incredible privilege that wherever we are, we can pause, we can pray without ceasing, and in that moment enter into the presence of the holy God, the righteous God, the loving God, the gracious God, the merciful God. And maybe in these last months, like nowhere else, we've been able to experience that reality that we can be still and know that he is God, because our lives in some ways probably have gotten a little more still. Maybe they're getting busier these days, but they have been a little bit still. And so Paul puts that right in the middle there. Yes, rejoice always. Let me make sure you got it. Rejoice always. I'll say it again. Rejoice. And don't be anxious. Don't let anything creep in and undermine your joy. In fact, just a few verses later, in verse 11, he says, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances. That circumstances can come and build anxiety. He says, I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. And how important is that for building joy in our life? That Paul said, I've been on both ends of the spectrum. I've had great prosperity. I've had a lack of everything. And in either circumstances, I can be content. Why? Because he knew the Lord was at hand. One of the realities we have to say about joy is that joy is one of those qualities listed as the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, and he goes on with the list. If we want to truly experience joy, we know the Lord is at hand. And as we press in to the Lord, as we find the secret to contentment, as we're not anxious but instead driven to pray, we can truly begin to see that there is much to rejoice about. There's much to be grateful for, and that we can return to the source of our joy, namely the God who loves us and who sent Jesus to die for us. So those are my encouragements this week. Don't lose your joy. Don't let the things that your mind wants to wonder and think about, or your heart wants to chase, pull you away from the central truth of the closeness and the nearness and the love and the grace and the mercy and the salvation that God has made possible for us. So I hope that encourages you this week as we're here in September. Hopefully we'll get to fall and a little cooler temperatures in the next week, and I know school is back in for many of our families, and what that means and how that kind of evolves over the next week or two as things change. And so there's a lot that we could be anxious about. There's a lot that can distract us, but I hope you'll hold on to that reality that God, by His Spirit, can bring you joy in the midst of any circumstance. Rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again. Rejoice. All right. Well, as always, I'm going to put the link to register for our services with this Facebook video. You can also go to our website, fbckl.com, and there's a link to register. It's helpful that you register. We've had some attendance as it's begun to pick up a few weeks. Not every week. It kind of goes up and down a little bit. But, we have our numbers that we can safely seat with distance, and so it helps us just to plan accordingly with that. So if you could just click on that link and let us know if you're planning to be here in person on Sunday. Also, as you can check us out here on Facebook or on our website, you can watch the streamed service as well. Either way, we hope you'll find time on Sunday to worship with us, to worship the Lord, to remember that He is near, to get that refresh and that reboost of the joy that He provides. So have a great Wednesday. I trust your week is going well, and look forward to seeing you in some form or fashion, connecting with you in some way on Sunday.